There it is. Beautiful. The treasure of the ages. There it is. Wow. Man the moon. Man the moon. The lunar age has begun.
Now, we will start. We will be present to you Andrea López, one of our front-end engineers with the deepest interest in data visualizations. She's a very cheerful person. I know her personally, and she really enjoys changes and keeps evolving. And that's why, that's the main reason. Actually, she's actually living in London and just came here to be with us today. So thank you very much for coming. She will be presenting the basics of Storybook and how you can use them to improve your team documentation. So yeah, big round of applause for Andrea.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Just give me a second. Okay. And yeah, as Pablo said, I'm going to speak to you how Storybook works and how you can improve your documentation on a daily basis using it. Okay, so I'm going to start saying that this presentation is split in 4 sections, okay? The first one is the why, to give you a bit of context. Next, we're going to see what's the Storybook about. Later on, we will continue with how you can use it in your projects. And finally, where are we using it right now in empathy? So, why should we use it? To think about it, we can start with a real project, for example, something like a music library, okay, like Spotify. Everyone knows Spotify. In Spotify, you have some album cards in which you can see some music, you can see some genres related to it, you know how it works. And actually, in Spotify, you have some components, like, for example, this one, the card component. The card component has some properties like the name of the card, the author, the genres, and so on. Okay, so imagine that we finish with our component and we now want to document it. And how we can do it? Okay, so the first thing that comes to our mind is maybe to do a plain documentation, okay? The typical Confluence page, the Notion page, and that's not bad, okay? But I found here 2 main disadvantages that are the first one, that it's difficult to find what you want. Because yeah, okay, this is nice, but later on when I read this 3 months later, I don't know where should I search for something, it's difficult in this case. And also because this is not maintainable at the end, because yeah, we have it working right now, we can understand it, but later when we have to change something, in this case it's simple because we only have 1 page, but maybe we have 50 or 100, we don't know. And we don't know the line of the page we have to change. This is difficult in this case. So that's when Storybook comes. Let's unveil how it's worked. And the thing about the Storybook is that we have dynamic documentation, because this documentation is connected with our real components. So this is actually the same documentation using a Storybook. You can see that the improvement is huge because there we have our card component, and we also have the same properties there explained, but in a different and more understandable way. So knowing this, we are going to the what. What is all of this about? So a Storybook is a playground for UI components that is actually written in JavaScript. And the thing about it is that you can test all your components there, like you can just dynamically check the different states of your component in a really easy way. It's also a front-end workshop because you don't have the context of the application there. You can just take your component without any interference of the context, for example, or I don't know, maybe the different business logic, what you want. So that's easier. And also that it's an open source project, something that I know that some of you might like. And the thing is that you can make a PR tomorrow if you want, so that's nice. And what are some of the advantages of a Storybook? Well, the first of all is the most obvious one, the one I was explaining before about the isolation, because you don't have the business logic there, you don't have anything that interferes with your component, and that's nice. Later on, that you can have a faster and efficient development because yeah, you can test your component there while you are working on it. You don't have to finish the documentation for doing so. You can just like write in parallel the documentation while you are testing it, and it's better in that way. It also enhances collaboration because you know that there's a gap between the team members sometimes, especially between developers and designers, and it's difficult to do some things sometimes, for example, to give feedback. And with this approach, you can actually give feedback while you are modifying your components. I mean, you can send the link to the documentation to the designer, and she can give feedback to you. You can change something really quickly. So that's nice. And also that it's a that has cross-framework support because most of the popular frameworks like Vue, React, I don't know, Angular have support for this library. So you can use it with them. And lastly, but not least, that it has some add-ons for customization. And you know, Storybook itself is nice, but you can also add some custom implementation if you want to make it better. So now we're going to the how section about how you can use it in your real project. So going to the same example about the music library, imagine that this is our main view of the application, okay, in which we have different components representing the albums we have on our library. So taking a look at this page, you have to start thinking about which components could we document. And I just found 3 in this case, that are the card component itself, which also has some components inside it, that are the icon button, you know, and the P, representing a genre. So we're going on it, we're going to document them. And the first thing we have to do is to install Storybook dependencies. You can do that with this command. This is for npm, but you also have on the top and in the bottom the commands for yarn and pnpm if you prefer. And when we have all of this installed, the first thing we have to do is to write a story. The stories of a Storybook are the way to just bring documentation in a dynamically way, and they are written in CSF format. That is basically ECMAScript 6 standard just for writing some JavaScript examples, and that's perfect for this occasion. So what we have to do is to configure the different stories we're going to have for a component, that's the one we have on the left, and create our story, this is the one we have for the icon button basic. So the configuration varies in a different ways. For example, we have the component we are referring on, the icon button in this case. That's what we want to document. The title, that gives you the way to structure your documentation. In this case, I want to have my component inside a general folder, okay? That's my preference. And the tags, something that it's optional, but gives you the possibility to generate auto documentation. We will see that later. And the archetypes, that is where the most complicated thing is. And that's what we have on the right. And the thing is that you can configure all the controls of your Storybook that is related with your component. So for example, imagine that we have a property size, okay, in your icon button. And it's an enumerable, so we can only select one of 6 values, for example. We have multiple ways to show it. Maybe you can have a text value in which you can write, I don't know, LG, for example. But what if we do a select? This is more intuitive and it's easier to test. And that's why here we're using the select one. Or for example, for the color, we can do the same. Instead of including just the code, we can have a control for color and just have a color picker there. So this is what we have generated with our code, okay? And the first thing is the autodocs, just with one line of code we included before, as you saw. And this is a story. The appearance is really similar. Just the autodocs have some improvements, and it also shows all your stories. You can have more than once, of course. Many of you want. And the thing is that you can interact and test your button just right there. As you can see, here we have the controls we defined before. And here I'm just changing the icon. I want to show the heart one, for example. And here I have the select for the size that I was mentioning before, and the color, of course. So if we want to improve the documentation we have before, we can do it with MDX documentation, that it's basically Markdown with some JavaScript on it. And the first thing we have to do is to include the meta tag we have on the left, just to reference the stories we are talking about in this case. Later on, we can write all your Markdown or your JavaScript code, whatever you like. So for example, I have there just a small description of the card with some headers and a div just to align a bit my content. The most important thing is that there I have described this story tag, I open it, and I'm sending the arguments I want to show at first on the right, on the final documentation. So if you see it, this is in this case for the card component, just to vary a bit. We have the card on the left because of some styles I applied to my div. And we have the controls that we showed before, but in this case, for the card component. I also decided to include because I think it's relevant, a code snippet at the end, and that's fine. So you can do whatever you want. And it's similar to the plain documentation, but you also have the controls. So in that way, it's a real improvement of it. So where are we using it? Okay, so the first example is the empathy playboard, in which we are using a Storybook just to document the most generic components. For example, the button, the pill, the switch, the text, and you can see that the controls are the same. You can actually decide to change the switch position to the right. I don't know, whatever you want. It's the same behavior we saw with the card. And regarding motif, we also have documentation for the motif playboard. And it's really similar, but the difference here is that we also have some documentation for the motif layouts on some assets that may be interesting for the user, like the icons they use, the classes they use for positioning, or maybe the color palettes. So in that way, they have a really rich documentation. We are finishing the presentation. So what do we learn from all of this? So the first thing is that the Storybook is a powerful tool. You have already seen that. And you can improve your documentation with all of it. Also, that this is a very maintainable documentation, because if you want to change something in your code, this is connected with it. And you, in some cases, don't have to do anything to change the contour. It depends if you want to change them, okay? And the last thing is that it makes everyone happier. For example, between developers and designers. And that's what I was talking before about the gap we have. We can make things faster, we can collaborate better, and we can improve our daily work. So I have left you there some links in case you want to see the Storybook documentation. And also I included special links for Vue in this case. That's what we use here. And a Storybook encyclopedia if you want to see some real examples of how a Storybook is used and try to do it by your own. So that's all on my side. Thank you so much for listening.
There it is.
The treasure of the ages.